Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 281, Isabel Horsfall. Warning: suicide is referred to in this episode, and it may be triggering for some. When Isabel Lippe died in 1921, her husband was not included in her will. He contested it, and it went all the way to the High Court. Why did Isabel omit her husband from her will? Isabel Horsfall was born on the 20th of August 1874 to John Sutcliffe Horsfall and Mary Maiden, the daughter of John Maiden from episode 171. Her birth was registered in Brighton, Victoria in 1875, and she was baptised on the 26th of November 1880 in Melbourne. Her father was born in Hayworth, Yorkshire on the 12th of September 1837 to Jonas and Martha Horsfall, and he was educated in Bradford. He then worked in the family woolen mills. Discontented, he migrated to Victoria in June 1856 when he was 19. In 1857, he joined the firm of Richard Goldsborough as a travelling representative, and by 1864 was given a share of the profits as well as a £1,000 salary. In 1862, he married Mary Maiden. Their children were Edith, who was born in 1863, Richard Ernest in 1865, Ethel Mary in 1867, Kate in 1870, and Lillian in 1870. Isabel was the youngest. In 1873, he became a partner with Richard Goldsborough and extended the business and built it up with a large personal following. In 1877, he became a director of the Australian Agency and Banking Corporation Limited, which in 1881 merged with R. Goldsborough and Company. In 1888, the firm amalgamated with Morton Company of Sydney to form Goldsborough Morton Company. Listen to bonus episode 20 for more information on the Mort family. Horsfall's first pastoral investment was Ensign, Gippsland. In the drought of the late 1880s, he acquired Widgewa, Momalong and Kirribilli in the Riverina, financed by Goldsborough Morton Company. In 1892, he became a pastoral advisor to the New Zealand Loan and Mercantile Agency, and in about 1894 he returned to Goldsborough Morton Company as a pastoral advisor. His secret price was a £10,000 advance to his son-in-law Rupert Carrington, and in 1904 his agreement with the firm was not renewed. Horsfall reluctantly gave £10,000 for a chapel in the memory of his daughter Edith at Trinity College in the University of Melbourne after Dr. Isabel Lippe had accepted his unmatriculated nephew. Horsfall visited England at least once and New Zealand many times. His great pleasure was boating. He kept a small fleet at Widgewa. He died on the 11th of June 1916 at Toorak, survived by a son and several daughters of his first wife, Mary Maiden, and by his second wife, Agnes Mahoney. He'd already provided for his daughters, and his son Richard inherited nearly £115,000. The news of John Horsfall's death was publicised in the Argus. Widespread regret will be caused by the news of the death of Mr. John Sutcliffe Horsfall, which occurred at his residence at Orrong in Toorak yesterday afternoon. Mr. Horsfall had recently returned from Sydney, and on the steamer he caught a chill that subsequently developed into pneumonia. Mr. Horsfall was conscious to the last and suffered no pain and died with his family around him. He was born in Yorkshire in 1837. His family for generations had been identified with the woolen trade as staplers and manufacturers. He at one time owned Widgewa Station, New South Wales near Narrandera, which he sold a few years ago to F.S. Faulkner and Sons, Ensay in Gippsland, Benalla near Benalla and Kungoola in Queensland. He also owned Momalong near Jerilderie. He had sold all these properties by the time of his death, and the only one that he owned was Kirribilli Station near Hay, New South Wales. He had one son, Richard, who survives him, and two daughters. One, the late Mrs. Carrington, was wife of Colonel Rupert Carrington, the brother of Lord Carrington. Mr. Horsfall's grandson, Lieutenant Rupert Carrington, is on active service and has been wounded twice. He was married twice. His first wife was the daughter of James Maiden, a well-known wool broker of Sydney. She died 2 or 3 years ago and he married again. Mr. Horsfall was a very determined man, and perhaps on no occasion did he prove this more thoroughly than at the great shearers' strike, when rather than give in to the demands that he regarded as unjust, he chose to lose somewhere about £50,000. He was an early riser and had a remarkable capacity for work, which he retained to an age when most men's physical powers are beginning to fail. His pleasure was in his work, but he was also a great reader. As a young man, he knew the Bronte family well, and this may have given a literary bent to his tastes. For sport, he generally cared little or nothing, but when he was younger he took a great deal of interest in athletics and was an oarsman with a more than ordinary merit. In the South African War, he raised a contingent of 100 bushmen and sent them to the front at his own expense. But this fine body of men never had a chance to distinguish themselves, however, for peace was declared a few days after they arrived. To the University of Melbourne, Mr. Horsfall was a very generous benefactor, and the Horsfall Memorial Chapel, which he gave in memory of his daughter, the late Mrs. Carrington, will cost many thousands by the time it is completed. In disposition he was genial, and he was a capital raconteur of experiences of the early strenuous colonial days. Mr. Horsfall was of a charitable disposition, though the greater part of his charity was hidden from the public. He liked to make personal gifts to those in distress, and with his death many poor people will miss a generous benefactor as well as a sympathetic friend. Interestingly, I found information that Isabel in fact was not John Sutcliffe Horsfall and Mary Maiden's biological daughter. Isabel was actually raised from the age of 4 by the Horsfalls. John Horsfall had a half-brother, Thomas, and he was in weakening health through respiratory problems, and he had financial struggles, and John Horsfall tried to help. So he adopted Thomas's eldest daughter, Isabel, and she was brought up with his children in Melbourne. Thomas Horsfall had been born in 1843 at Todmorden in Yorkshire, England, and he died on the 18th of September 1886 in Baghdad, Tasmania. Isabel was born in 1870, and they had other children, and it seems that they stayed with them. Isabel's biological mother, Sarah Reynolds, died in 1896 in Tasmania. On the 7th of February 1890 in the Melbourne Table Talk, Colonel George Washington Sherman of the US Army, late of Ensor House in Melbourne, by his will dated the 3rd of December 1889, appointed John Sutcliffe Horsfall of Melbourne executor, and left to the latter's daughter, Isabel Horsfall, all his real and personal estate absolutely. This was sworn at £1,580 of personal. The estate consists of 1,400 shares in the Victoria Brewery Company with dividends thereon and some jewellery. And his death notice on the 21st of December 1889 says that George Washington Sherman was a colonel in the Army of the United States of America and was only 42. On the 1st of June 1895 in the Tarrangara Times and Malden Advertiser in Victoria. On the 18th of May, the Honorary Rupert Carrington gave an at-home at LV Toorak, the residence of Mrs. Horsfall. The evening was in the honour of the coming out of Miss Isabel Horsfall, sister of Mrs. Carrington. And then in 1898, Isabel Horsfall of Orong, Clendon Road, Toorak, reports stolen from her recent dwelling at Manor Street, Brighton, a crocodile or lizard skin purse with a clasp fastening, labelled JH 21st of August 1897 on a silver plate on the outside, containing £1 and 1 shilling, and a lady's gold chain 4 foot long with fine links mounted with 12 pearls, value £19. On the 8th of August 1912, in the Melbourne Table Talk, it announced that Miss Isabel Horsfall, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Horsfall of Orong, Toorak, has returned to Melbourne from a trip to Colombo and a few other attractive resorts with the brand of engaged stamped upon her. But so far she has not divulged to anyone outside the family circle the name of the happy man, so that her friends may not overwhelm him with congratulations, which is his choice, and when they are ready and waiting to do so, the announcement will occur. On the 26th of April 1913 in the Victorian Paran Telegraph, Miss Isabel Horsfall, daughter of Mr. Horsfall of Orong, Toorak, whose engagement to John Lippe has left on a 6-week trip to New Zealand. After their marriage, which is to take place shortly, they'll reside on the property near Woodend, which Mr. Horsfall has purchased for his daughter. So they married on the 7th of May 1913 in Christchurch, New Zealand, and John Lippe's full name was John Nicholson Lippe. On the 22nd of May 1913 in the Melbourne Table Talk, The marriage of Miss Isabel Horsfall to Mr. John Lippe took place in New Zealand earlier this month, and it came as a tremendous surprise to all of her friends in Melbourne, who had no idea such an event was being celebrated in the Dominion. The bride has always averred her intention of avoiding the conventional ceremony, but had never hinted at such a thing as getting married out of the Commonwealth. Mr. and Mrs. Lippe will return to Melbourne at the conclusion of their honeymoon and will settle at Wood End. And the marriage notice stated that they married at St Michael's Church in Christchurch, and that John Lippe was the son of John Lippe of Aberdeen, Scotland. On 26th of June 1913 in the Melbourne Punch, it says Mr. and Mrs. Lippe, the latter well known as Isabel Horsfall, returned from their honeymoon a fortnight ago and stayed a week at Brighton with the bride's mother prior to settling down in their country home 14 miles from Wood End. A year later, on the 9th of July 1914 in the Melbourne Punch, it says that Mr. and Mrs. Lippe have gone to Fiji for the winter months to escape the cold of Wood End. On the 9th of February 1915 in the Melbourne Herald, it says that while her husband is absent in New Zealand, Mrs. John Lippe, née Isabel Horsfall, will stay with her father, Mr. J.G. Horsfall, at Orong, Toorak. Then on the 25th of July 1916 in the Melbourne Herald, Mrs. John Lippe, née Miss Isabel Horsfall, is staying at Brighton with her cousins, the Mrs. Blair, before returning to her farm near Wood End. She is making a slow recovery after a recent motor accident. And on the 20th of June 1921 in the Melbourne Herald, in Kyneton, inquiries made here have elicited the information that Mrs. Isabel Lippe, whose body was found at the foot of the cliffs at Watson's Bay, Sydney, left Kyneton on Friday afternoon the 10th of June by her motor car for Melbourne. She reached Spencer Street Station before 5 p.m. and boarded the express to Sydney. When Mrs. Lippe first came to the Kyneton district, she purchased a property at Tilden and built a fine home, which she afterwards sold. About 6 years ago, she purchased Hollywood, a valuable property of 42 acres, including a large brick villa residence within half a mile of the Kyneton railway station. Here she lived in a retired life, but was keenly interested in art, photography and other hobbies. The house was beautifully furnished and Mrs. Lippe frequently entertained city friends there. She gave substantial financial assistance to worthy objects whenever she was approached. Mrs. Lippe was the daughter of the late Mr. Horsfall, whose donations to Trinity College are well known. In the Melbourne Argus 4 days later, interest in the tragic death in Sydney of Mrs. Isabel Lippe of Hollywood on Tilden Road has been quickened by inquiries being made by the police into her affairs. Mrs. Lippe was but little known to the Kyneton people. She lived quietly in a picturesque brick villa 1.25 miles from town. About 10 years ago, her father, the late Mr. J.S. Horsfall, presented her with a property near the Carlsruhe station. It was a wedding gift, and while the house was being constructed, Miss Horsfall, as she was then, visited New Zealand and married Mr. Lippe. According to local residents, he was a mountain guide, and the pair met while Miss Horsfall was travelling in New Zealand. After some years of married life, Mrs. Lippe and her husband separated by mutual consent, and he returned to New Zealand. 2 years ago, she sold the property at Carlsruhe and purchased Hollywood. Mrs. Lippe had an income of £700 a year from her father's estate, but it is said that this ceased upon her death if she had no children. It was her custom to visit Melbourne regularly, and in the last few months she invariably hired a motor car for the journey. On Friday week, she travelled to Melbourne by car and, as far as is known, took the express to Sydney. Before leaving Kyneton, she took a considerable sum of money from the bank. The bank authorities have not disclosed the amount, but it is said that she contemplated a long stay and took sufficient for her requirements. The next heard of her by Kyneton residents was the announcement her body had been found at the foot of the cliffs at the Gap near South Head, Sydney. The police, of course, interested themselves in the question of what became of the money which Mrs. Lippe took with her to Sydney. Another statement engaging the attention of the police is that Hollywood has recently passed out of her hands. If this is so, the amount paid for the property and the disposal of the money will of course be looked into. It was recently reported to Sergeant Hoare of Kyneton that on the morning after Mrs. Lippe departed for Sydney, a party in a motor car had visited and entered the premises. According to the police, there's evidence that Hollywood was entered, but they could find no traces of robbery. On a dressing table in one of the rooms, an old-fashioned gold watch lay. An inscription upon it, the police say, showed that it had been presented to a colonel, but they declined to give any further information. For some time, Mrs. Lippe had not kept a maid, and as far as the police could see, everything was just as she had placed it before her departure to Sydney. The place was artistically furnished, and apparently nothing was disturbed. It may therefore be that a party of friends unaware of her departure for Sydney paid her a surprise visit. During the war, Mrs. Lippe frequently subscribed to the patriotic funds, but her donations were sent in but with little comment. She proved her sympathy with various causes in this way, but she took no active part in the work. A Kyneton lady said tonight that she indicated rather than said that she was not anxious to visit or to be visited. Then there was a follow-up in the article saying, "Letter causes investigation, Sydney on Thursday. It has been ascertained that Mrs. Isabel Lippe of Kyneton, Victoria, whose body was found at the foot of the cliffs at the Gap in Watson's Bay, Sydney, left a letter at the hotel in Sydney at which she was staying. The police have taken possession of the letter. They are disinclined to state what it contains, but it is known that things are set out in the letter which are causing the police to make considerable investigation. The inquest will be held next week." On the 2nd of July 1921, in the Maitland Weekly Mercury of New South Wales, investigations by the Melbourne Police into the death of Mrs. Isabel Lippe at the Gap, Watson's Bay in Sydney on the 14th of June have established the fact that shortly before her departure for Sydney, Mrs. Lippe transferred Hollywood, her Kyneton home, to a young man who was in no way related to her. The transfer was made as a deed of gift under the terms of a will drawn up recently. She also left other property to the same person, the will being witnessed by a Kyneton clergyman and his wife. In the Sydney Evening News on the 14th of July 1921, Rich Widow's Queer Letters. Man mentioned in will tells strange story. A wealthy Victorian society woman, Mrs. Isabel Lippe, 47, who lived at Hollywood, Kyneton, was found lying dead on the rocks at the foot of the cliffs at the Gap, Watson's Bay on the 14th of June. She left Melbourne on the 10th of June, arriving in Sydney on the 13th of June and stayed at Petty's Hotel. The mystery surrounding her death was investigated by Mr. Jamieson, the coroner, at the coroner's court today. Mr. Curtis appeared for Mrs. Lippe's relatives, and Mr. Bathgate and Mr. Nodes for Charles Ernest McAllister Smith, 39, a musician of Upper Hawthorn, Melbourne. He was arrested recently and remanded at the Melbourne court on a charge of having forged Mrs. Lippe's name on a telegram. Bruce Hedderwick, a Melbourne solicitor, said he'd known Mrs. Lippe for about 8 years. She was born in Elstonwick, Victoria, was married, and was living apart from her husband. His name was John Nicholson Lippe, and the witness had last heard of him in New Zealand. Her life was not insured in his knowledge. He last saw Mrs. Lippe on February 17th at her home at Kyneton. She appeared to be in good health. The coroner asked if she'd said anything about coming to Sydney, and he said no. On the 10th of June, she called at my office. However, I did not see her. On the 9th of June, had you a will? Yes, she signed it on the 12th of February. He said that on the 1st of June, he received a letter card from Mrs. Lippe asking him to forward her will to Kyneton, which he did. The solicitor was asked, "Is it correct that she left everything to Mr. McAllister Smith?" He said yes. "And is he no relation?" No. "Had your firm had anything to do with the preparation of this will?" He said none whatsoever. "Had she the belief that the Catholics were about to rob her?" Yes. "She told me on the 12th of February that she was under the impression that the Catholics were working against her." "Did she mention Mr. McAllister Smith?" Yes. "She said that he was working with her against the Catholics." "Do you know when she first met Mr. Smith?" He said last October. "Did she ever say anything of an intention to take her own life?" And he said no. George Murdoch, the licensee of Petty's Hotel, said that Miss Lippe had stayed at the hotel previously. She wired on the 10th of June asking for a room to be reserved. On Sunday evening, a clerk named Green showed him a letter addressed to C. Mac Smith and said that she told him to put it in the rack and that the gentleman to whom it was addressed would call in for it in a day or two. Mac Smith stayed at the hotel in February. Witness said he would like to see Mrs. Lippe and she came to the office. He asked her if she knew the man to whom the letter was addressed. She said yes. The coroner asked what was her manner. He said she was normal, but resented my questioning her about it. "What reasons do you have to be asking Mrs. Lippe the questions?" He said Mr. Mac Smith's behaviour and manner was, to say the least, extraordinary. He told many things in our conversations which I did not believe. "Did he tell you what his occupation was?" He said he was a doctor of medicine The coroner asked, "You formed some doubt as to whether he was a suitable companion for her," and he said yes. Mr. Curtis went on to say he spent money very freely. Millicent Frances Lewis said that she'd known Mrs. Lippe since October, having met her at Petty's Hotel. Afterwards, she went to Melbourne with her as a companion. She remained there until the May when she returned to Sydney. Witness said that Mrs. Lippe was in good health when she was with her in Melbourne and appeared quite normal mentally. "Did you ever hear anything about someone trying to take her property from her?" She said she did. "Did you regard it as peculiar?" She said no. Charles Ernest McAllister Smith gave evidence. He'd known Mrs. Lippe for several years. He was asked, "From January up to the present, how have you earned a living?" "From money received from Mrs. Lippe." "How much have you received in that period?" "About £400. I cannot say exactly." "When did you become a constant visitor at her house?" He said last October. "You see a will is made out in favour of you?" And he said yes, Mr. Hedwick read it to me in his office. "Prior to the will, did Mrs. Lippe make a conveyance to you or her property at Kyneton?" "She did. It was made at the solicitor's office." "Did she tell you she was going to make a will?" "No, it came as a surprise to me." "Did you tell her that the Catholics were going to attack her and carry her away?" He said it was her own idea. I am suggesting that you deliberately got Mrs. Lewis and Mrs. Lippe to believe that Mrs. Lippe's life would be taken, and he said it is not so. "Is it a fact that these two women were all night for 10 nights defending their house?" He said no. "Do you believe Mrs. Lippe was suffering from delusions?" "Yes." The witness said that he was with Mrs. Lippe in Sydney the day before her death. Detective Thompson produced a letter found at Mrs. Lippe's residence in Kyneton, stating, "It's a God's world, not the Pope's. God rules the world by love, the Pope by fear. I am one of God's servants, so is the King. I live in God's house all the week, not just for an hour on Sundays. There is a little bit of good in the worst of us, and I try to find it and work on it. Mother always said, if you do your best, it will come right in the end. I've always prayed that God would let me get all troubles over before I am old, and my prayer has been answered. I feel each day will bring me happiness as I am working for the good of the world, not for myself. Mac and I both want to help everyone, to pull them up, not down." Mr. Hedwick, her solicitor, said the deceased was a peculiar woman. She believed in sin finers or Catholics were out to take her property from her. She said to him once that Smith was working with her against the Catholics. She never said she might reward Smith. The letter left on the rack for Mac Smith at Petty's Hotel said, "Dear Mac, I'm going to end it all. I cannot go any longer. It seems impossible for any happiness to come into my life. You've been good to me and I'm grateful. I don't want you to fret. Happiness will come to me on the other side where I'll wait for you. The Roman Catholics ruined our home life. Now they have got John, that is her husband. He is on their side and he may find me any day. You and I can never belong to each other while John is alive, so now Hollywood is yours. It is better for me to go where love will surround me and my soul will watch over you. Be good to Rags. Yours, Isabel." Charles Smith had known the deceased for several years. Charles Smith said he received some money from the deceased, altogether about £400. He did not lead the deceased to believe that she was in danger of persecution, and he never told her he was carrying on a fight against the Catholics or that the Catholics were going to attack her. "I suggest that you deliberately got this woman to believe that her life would be taken," and he said, "It is not so." The witness further said he received the money from the deceased for his services. He might have told the deceased that on a certain date her house would be attacked. He'd never urged the deceased to erect barbed wire entanglements. He did not recommend the deceased to procure large stocks of groceries in case of a siege. He did not think he told the deceased that the opposition had a machine gun trained on her house. The witness said that he came to Sydney posing as a wealthy man and wanting to be instructed in the faith. He did that with the object of carrying out the deceased's wishes. When Mrs. Lippe and him were in Sydney, Mrs. Lippe gave him some money and wanted him to run away with her, but he refused. The deceased did not mention anything about suicide, nor were there any threats against her life. When he heard the news of Mrs. Lippe's death, he rang up her solicitor, saying that when he saw the deceased enter the train for Sydney, he thought she was going back to Kyneton. He told that lie because he didn't want to be dragged into anything. Mr. Curtis said, "I propose to prove by the evidence that the will mentioned is in the handwriting of the man himself. I proposed to prove by Mrs. Lewis, who was staying with the deceased at her home, that this man was continually organising this plan to make these women believe their lives and properties were in danger, and that this unfortunate woman took her life believing she was being poisoned, and that this man was the organiser of what happened. The coroner said, I believe there is a certain amount of truth in your suggestions, but where does this lead us? Unless you show there is something that could be construed as a threat to kill or a direct invitation to do so. And the inquest was adjourned. On the 14th of October 1921, in the Dubbo Dispatch and Wellington Independent, Victorian detectives are investigating the death of Mrs. C. Lippe of Kyneton, whose body was recently found at the Gap. Victorian detectives are investigating a watercolour painting at the Kyneton residence of Mrs. Lippe. It was similar to one of the 4 original paintings which were alleged to have been stolen from a flat in Collins Street. Subsequently, Charles Ernest McAllister Smith, 22, a musician, was arrested on a charge of having between the 1st of July 1920 and February the 10th 1921 stolen from the dwelling of Charles Gregory 4 watercolour pictures valued at £20. Smith was allowed bail. On the 5th of May 1922 in the Ballarat Star, sequel to a tragedy. In Melbourne, the legal complications associated with the will of Isabel Lippe, formerly of Hollywood, who met her death in tragic circumstances in Sydney last year, were mentioned again in the practice court today. On the return of an order nisi calling upon the cavator, her husband, John Nicholson Lippe, to show cause why probate should not be granted to a draft of a will dated the 13th of February 1921. The executor, Bruce Hedderwick, in an affidavit said the original of the will of 13th of February 1921 could not be found on the death of the testatrix. Under this will, she bequeathed her estate, valued at £7,621, to various friends. On the 13th of May, she made another will in favour of Charles Ernest McAllister Smith, who was created sole executor, but apparently this was not properly executed. On the 31st of May, Mrs. Lippe wrote to him asking him to send her the February will as she wished to make alterations. She sent the will by registered letter and on the 10th of June was received at the solicitor's office, containing a will in favour of Smith. He was instructed to keep the envelope containing the will sealed. On her death it was opened and found that the will was in favour of Smith, which, however, had not been properly executed in the presence of witnesses, therefore it was invalid. As the original will of the 13th of February could not be found, probate was now sought for the draft of that document. The application was opposed by the deceased's husband, who was described as a guide residing in New Zealand. He is not a beneficiary under the will of the 13th of February, which he contends must be presumed to have been revoked by the destruction at the hands of his late wife. In the event of intestacy being declared, he would be interested in the distribution of the deceased's estate. His Honour said he would put the matter in the list for hearings in the practice court, and he directed discovery of certain documents. In the paperwork related to Isabel Lippe's will, it says that on the 26th day of September 1921, a letter that was dated the 12th of September 1921 was received to the solicitor's office from John Nicholson Lippe of Tarriora East via Tinaroo. Dear Sir, Mr. Hedderwick, your letter to hand with notice of my wife's death. I am sorry to say I saw it in the papers here. Can I claim anything of her estate? Please let me know. If not, do not bother with me, as I would wish to forget my unhappy past. No doubt, Mr. Hedderwick, people will say that I am the means of this. Had my wife treated me better, things would have been different. I am sorry she came to such an untimely end. I wish I had been near to her when she took that fatal leap at Watson's Bay. Yours sincerely, J. Lippe. Then the solicitor's office replied to him on the 27th of September 1921. In reply to your inquiry as to whether you can claim anything of your late wife's estate, we have to advise you that if the draft will is admitted to probate, then you will not be entitled to anything, as previously pointed out to you. If you can establish an intestacy, either by reason that the will cannot be proved, or by proof that the testatrix was incapable of making a will, or that she was unduly influenced, then in either case you'll be entitled to half of her estate. In order to give you an opportunity of considering the foregoing position, the notice of application for probate, dated the 1st, was given to you. Then John Lippe wrote a further letter on the 11th of October. Mr. Hedderwick, in answer to your letter of last week, I am sure Mrs. Lippe influenced against me, by whom I do not know, by the attitude she took with me, as I was not a drunkard when we parted, neither did I have DTs, which she also said I had. I can safely say she suffered with delusions whilst I lived with her. She imagined that I was always drunk when living with her. She was at times worse than others with delusions. She got Dr. Rigby of Kyneton to say that he treated me for DT, which I never had. I was told that by letter after we parted, as I can prove by the letter I kept, wrote by Mrs. Lippe. Had Mrs. Lippe taken my advice when she went for the separation and gave me an allowance of £1 per week for working on her farm, she would be alive and happy today. Mr. Hedderwick, you had known me personally, and I think you would be a very straight man. The cause of the trouble between Mrs. Lippe and I was that she was wealthy and I was a poor working man. While I lived with her, my life was not worth living, as I could not do anything to please her. While I lived with her, I had not a penny I could call my own. When I asked her for pocket money, she used to insult me, so I could not stand it any longer. Then I told her a few truths I was told about before marriage, which she did not like to hear. I only wish she was alive today with no money and with me today, and we could be happy then. Yours obediently, John Lippe. On the 12th of September 1922, in the Grafton Daily Examiner, Mrs. Isabel Lippe, 42, left a sum of £10,000 behind her. McAllister Smith was employed by the unfortunate deceased woman as a sort of manager at a salary, and to him, in her last will and testament, executed not long before the tragic termination of her life, she left everything to him, and, in addition, the sole executor of the property. However, the will was upset on the grounds that one of the witnesses to the testator's signature was not present at the time of the testator's signing, and McAllister Smith got nothing. Then the husband of the deceased woman, a mountain guide in New Zealand, stepped in the legal arena, claiming one half of the estate on the grounds that his wife had died interstate, as the will in favour of McAllister Smith had been disproved and the prior will, which it substituted, had been destroyed. In the destroyed will, Mrs. Lippe left, subject to small bequests, 3 parts of her property to her faithful housekeeper, Sarah Mackay of Armidale, and the other part to Emma Letitia Carter, daughter of a police magistrate. The husband, Lippe, lodged a caveat against the probate of this draft of the destroyed will. Argument was heard in due course, and the Chief Justice made the order nisi absolute with costs. This means that probate proceeds in respect of the draft of the destroyed will, under which the late Mrs. Lippe's housekeeper gets 3/4, and her husband John Nicholson Lippe gets nothing. The Chief Justice said recently it was argued on behalf of the cavator, John Lippe, that the will must have been destroyed with the intention of revoking the same, while on behalf of the executor it was argued that the circumstances in which it was destroyed, if it was destroyed, was by destroying the previous will she would be removing something that might, in her opinion, stand in the way of the later supposed will. And now, as a result of John Nicholson Lippe's appeal, it is going to the High Court. In the Melbourne Sun News pictorial on the 25th of October 1922, the High Court dismissed the main appeal but ordered that the costs of the appeal to the Supreme Court should be paid out of the estate and that Lippe should pay the costs of the latest appeal. John Lippe remained living in New Zealand and he died in 1960. Now to a little bit on Isabel's siblings in her adopted family. Edith was the firstborn. She was born on the 14th of June 1863 in Melbourne and married Rupert Clement George Carrington, the second son of the second Baron Carrington, whose original name was Smith until the first Baron changed it in 1839. In August 1880, he and his brothers were authorised by royal licence to continue to use the family name of Carrington with one R in lieu of Carrington with a double R, which was the title of the baronetcy. He was living in New Norfolk, Tasmania in 1891, and this is where he married Edith Horsfall. On the 25th of April 1891, in the Sydney Australian Town and Country Journal, Miss Horsfall's wedding took place in Tasmania at the end of March. The Honorary Rupert Carrington was for some time the aide-de-camp to his brother, Lord Carrington, and his wife. She is the daughter of Mr. J.S. Horsfall of Toorak, Melbourne, and Widgewa Station. The Honorary and Mrs. Carrington are presently on a visit to Melbourne. Rupert was 11 years older than Edith. On the 30th of June 1893 in the Albury Banner and Wodonga Express, Mr. and Mrs. Rupert Carrington. Letters received by the mail, says a Melbourne contemporary, furnish some particulars of the welcome given by Lord and Lady Carrington to the Honorary Rupert and Mrs. Carrington. They've been dividing their time with Mr. Carrington's two sisters, the Countess of Harrington at Elverston Castle, Derbyshire, and Lady Colville of Culross, and have been fulfilling a round of engagements. Lord and Lady Carrington gave a large dinner party and afterwards a ball, the Prince of Wales being a guest on both occasions. He danced his only dance with Mrs. Rupert and made a host of keen inquiries about Australians. Mrs. Rupert was present at the Queen's drawing room on the 16th of May by Lady Blytheswood. Lady Harrington gave a lunch on the 20th of May at Hurlingham for the New South Wales Cavalry, at which Mr. and Mrs. Rupert Carrington were present. On the 18th of May, they went with Lady Carrington to the House of Lords to see Lord Blytheswood take his seat. They will not return to Australia until the end of the year, as Mr. Carrington is going to stay for the deer stalking. Rupert was educated at Eton and commissioned as a lieutenant in the Grenadier Guards in October 1871. He served in the Zulu War in 1879 as acting adjutant of the 1st Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot, and later commanded a troop of mounted infantry. In 1884, Carrington had retired from the Grenadier Guards with a gratuity, and in 1887 came to New South Wales, where his brother Charles was governor. He was appointed a captain on the headquarters staff of the New South Wales Military Forces, and on the 23rd of March in the next year was made aide-de-camp to his brother and held this post until 1890. After his marriage to Edith, he became a grazier and part owner with his father-in-law in Momalong Station in the Riverina. His share in the property was financed by a £10,000 loan which Horsfall negotiated with Goldsborough Morton Company. Carrington was placed on the reserve of officers in 1900, but in February 1901 went to the South African War as a major of the 2nd Regiment, New South Wales Mounted Rifles. He was promoted Lieutenant Colonel in May 1902 and that month at Glersthorpe formed and commanded the 3rd New South Wales Imperial Bushmen's Regiment. This regiment was made up of time-expired men from other Australian regiments and was later augmented by a draft of Riverina Bushmen raised by his father-in-law. Carrington was awarded the Distinguished Services Order and mentioned in dispatches. He returned to Momalong in July 1902 and was appointed CVO in 1905. He commanded the 6th Australian Light Horse Regiment in 1904 to 1910 and was honorary aide-de-camp to the Governors-General from 1912 to 1917. He was promoted to Colonel in 1911 and retired from the military forces in 1918. Edith died in 1908 in Armidale, Victoria, aged only 45. Mrs. Rupert Carrington, wife of Lieutenant Colonel Carrington, who's the brother of Lord Carrington, has died at Toorak. She was the daughter of Mr. J.S. Horsfall, a well-known pastoralist, and had been invalid at her father's home in Toorak for several weeks. The news was received with feelings of regret by all who knew her, and the deepest sympathies felt for the bereaved husband. In May 1915, his brother's only son had been killed in action, and Carrington became heir to the barony. He returned to England after World War I, and in 1928 succeeded as the 4th Baron. He died of heart disease on the 11th of November 1929 at his residence in Eaton Place, Westminster. They had one child, Rupert Victor Carrington, who was born on the 20th of December 1891 in Armidale, Victoria, and he in turn inherited the baronetcy. On the 5th of August 1916 in the Melbourne Australasian, St Peter's, Eaton Square, London was the scene of a pretty wedding on the 23rd of May between Mr Rupert Carrington, son of Colonel, the Honorary R. Carrington DSO, and Honorary Sybil Colville, daughter of Lieutenant Colonel Viscount Colville and Viscountess Colville of Millhanger Thursley, Godalming. Sir Rupert and Sybil remained in England and had 2 children, Elizabeth and Peter, who became the 6th Baron, who died in 2018, and it then passed on to his son Rupert. Rupert has served as Lord Great Chamberlain of England since the accession of King Charles in September 2022. Isabel's next sibling was Richard Ernest Horsfall, who was born on the 25th of October 1865 in Melbourne. He married Ada Kate Fosbury in Sydney in 1908 when Richard was 43 and Ada 45. Their wedding was mentioned in the newspaper. Top Cross Society was electrified on Saturday when the marriage column proclaimed that Richard Ernest Horsfall married Ada Kate Fosbury at the Christchurch in Sydney. At last, it gasped with one long collective gasp. Richard Ernest, commonly known as Dick, is the son of Squatter Horsfall of Widgewa, Narrandera. Their marriage occurred only a fortnight after his sister Edith died. In 1919, they were living at Toorak and Richard was listed as a grazier, and by 1921 they were living in London, which is where he died at the age of 74 on the 29th of May 1940. His probate came in at £2,428, 6 shillings in England. However, on the 18th of June 1941, in the Melbourne Age, it stated that an estate of £157,911, consisting of realty of £16,300 and personalty of £141,611, was left by Richard Ernest Horsfall, late of Clendon Road, Toorak. He left his widow an annuity of £1,000 a year and the income from the residuary trust fund to Mrs. Mary Alice Halliday Patterson for life. However, on the 20th of June 1941 in the Narrandera Argus and Riverina Advertiser, it says that he was a widower without family and he left all of his estate to strangers in blood residing in England. Upon closer inspection of his will in Victoria, it says that he devises and bequeaths the home at Toorak, Melbourne, known as Orrong, to be placed in his trust. Upon trust, he permits Rupert Victor John, Baron Carrington, hereinafter called Lord Carrington, to use and occupy and enjoy the said property and its effects during his life. After the death of Lord Carrington, my trustees shall hold the property and the effects upon trust for any children or child of Lord Carrington, and if more than one child, equal shares as tenants in common. Provided nevertheless that if Lord Carrington requests the trustees to sell the said property, the trustees can do so. Then Lord Carrington is to receive an annual income from the sale of the property during his life, and after the death of Lord Carrington, capital and income is to be provided for any children or child of Lord Carrington. Also from the trust to pay the annual income of the trust fund to Mrs. Mary Alice Halliday Patterson, whose permanent address is care of Commercial Banking Company of Sydney Limited, of 8 Birchin Lane in London, during her life. After the death of Alice Halliday Patterson, the trust income is to be passed on to the children of the said Mary Alice Halliday Patterson. However, on the 18th of April 1939, there was a codicil, so a change to his will. It says, I, Richard Ernest Horsfall, of Orrong, Toorak, Melbourne, Australia, now temporarily residing at the Hands Crescent Hotel in London, declare this to be a first codicil taking place on the 18th of April 1939. To my will, which was dated the 20th of November 1930. I revoke the devise and bequest to Rupert Victor John, Baron Carrington and his children contained in Clause 3 of my will. In Clause 4 of my will, I have bequeathed to my wife an annuity of £1,500. I now direct that it be read as £1,000 bequeathed to my wife. So effectively, it seems that Mary Alice Halliday Patterson became virtually the sole beneficiary of his will. So who was Mary Alice Halliday? She was born in England in 1886, and she was a domestic servant living in Lancashire, England, until 1921 when she departed England with her family and emigrated to South Africa. Now, earlier on in the episode, I talked about how it seems that Isabel's father was Thomas Horsfall. Well, his brother Jonas Horsfall lived in South Africa, so whether there was a link somehow there, because Mary Alice Halliday arrived in Albany, Western Australia in 1921, and she used the hyphenated surname Halliday Patterson. I cannot find a marriage record with John Austin Patterson, but family trees say that the marriage must have occurred before 1950, as they are on a trip to England in 1950 when they're in their 60s, and Mary is listed as Mary Alice Patterson. Other than that, I cannot find any direct link between Richard Horsfall, Richard's wife Kate, to the Halliday family or to the Patterson family, other than John Austin Patterson was a wool buyer. He was very much in the import and export market. So whether there was a connection there as well, but why give his wife the sole proceeds of his will when her husband, John Austin Patterson, lived until 1963? Mary Alice Halliday lived until the age of 99 years and she died at Manoora, Western Australia in 1985. In March 1933, in the ISIS Recorder of Childers, Queensland, it says, quietly living in Sydney, says Orange Leader's Sydney Gossip, is Mrs. Richard Horsfall. She has a flat at Hampton Court and is trying to find old associations in a new Sydney, as she puts it. Mrs. Horsfall was Ada Fosbury, daughter of the Chief Commissioner of Police. Her engagement with Mr. Horsfall was quite a romance. It lasted for 15 years because Richard's father would not give his consent. Finally, the couple married and went to London. After some years, they had a quarrel and separated. Meeting by chance on top of an omnibus, Mr. Horsfall asked Mrs. Horsfall to return. She refused and an argument became heated. The conductor approached and tapped Mr. Horsfall on the shoulder and said, "Here, I can't have this, sir. You are annoying this lady." "Lady be damned," said Mr. Horsfall. "She's my wife." So that gives a little bit of an insight that clearly the marriage was not a happy one. So do we find that Mary Halliday has been given the sole beneficiary of this will as a result of this separation? Another sister, Ethel Mary, who was born on the 22nd of April 1867 in South Yarra, died in 1876, aged only 9. Kate, who was recorded as being born in 1870, must have been stillborn as a twin, as Richard, Ethel and Lillian were all baptised on the same day, the 8th of December 1871. And another sister, Lillian, was born on the 5th of January 1870. She's recorded as living at 7 Hawthorne Road in Caulfield, and she died in 1923 in Caulfield. On the 7th of August 1923 in the Melbourne Sun News pictorial, it says Lillian Horsfall, late of Hawthorne Road, Caulfield, spinster, who died on the 6th of July, with the will dated the 21st of July 1921, left £2,430 in realty and £4,069 in personalty to Sydney David V. Steed. Further information on David V. Steed is in my episode on Australia's Own Duchess, episode 226. David's sister, Nell, married the Duke of Manchester. David was born in South Yarra in 1906, and in May 1933 he left Australia and became engaged to Lady Louise Montague, the Duke of Manchester's sister. However, they did not end up marrying, and he died in London in 1959. So in this episode, there's quite a few unanswered questions. What unfortunately did occur, though, for poor Isabel is that she did choose to take her own life. As you can see, it was very difficult to ascertain why this occurred and how much influence she had around her. But she came from quite an influential family who also had influential links, and that was interesting to research as well. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.